Wyoming Territory, 1883. The frontier town of Clearwater Creek existed on the knife's edge between civilization and wilderness, where a man's word was his bond and a woman's secrets were her armor. Dust from the main street clung to everything: boots, dresses, hopes, and dreams, coating them all in the same earthen hue that blanketed the vast landscape. Zeke Yardley believed one thing above all else: a man riding alone stayed alive. At 26, he'd buried too many friends who'd made the mistake of putting their trust in others. The frontier demanded vigilance, and attachments were nothing but vulnerabilities waiting to be exploited. His parents' murder by bandits when he was 16 had taught him that lesson in blood. The morning sun cast long shadows across the weathered planks of Clearwater Creek's boardwalk as Zeke stepped out of the general store. His lean frame carried the casual readiness of a man accustomed to trouble, though his face still held the smoothness of youth beneath a two-day stubble. The Winchester rifle he carried wasn't for show. It was as much a part of him as his right arm. Sheriff Mills nodded as Zeke passed. "Heading back to your place today?" "Soon as I pick up supplies," Zeke replied, adjusting his Stetson against the glare. "Cattle need tending, and that fence line won't fix itself." His small ranch 10 miles outside of town wasn't much, 100 acres with 40 head of cattle, but it was his, paid for with 6 years of backbreaking work on other men's land. He wanted nothing more than to build it into something substantial, something that would last, something no one could take from him. What he didn't want or need was company. Company meant complications. The smell of fresh bread pulled his attention toward the town's only bakery. He hadn't intended to stop, but his stomach reminded him breakfast had been hours ago. The bell above the door jingled as he stepped inside, the warm air enveloping him in the scent of cinnamon and sugar. And there she was. Zeke had heard talk of the new baker's assistant who'd arrived on last week's stagecoach, but Clearwater Creek saw its share of drifters and dreamers who rarely stayed long enough to learn their names. This one made him pause. She stood behind the counter, hands dusted with flour, her slender fingers working deftly to arrange fresh rolls in a basket. Her dress was simple cornflower blue calico with a practical white apron, but it complemented the rich chestnut waves that fell past her shoulders, partially contained by a simple ribbon. When she looked up, eyes the color of warm honey met his, and for a moment Zeke forgot his own name. "Can I help you, sir?" Her voice carried a soft accent he couldn't place, not quite southern but certainly not western either. "Just looking for something to tide me over till supper," he managed. She smiled, and something shifted in the air between them. The cinnamon rolls just came out of the oven. "Best eaten while they're warm." "I'll take one then." As she wrapped the pastry in paper, he noticed the careful precision of her movements, the way her eyes remained downcast except when directly addressed. There was a wariness there familiar to anyone who'd spent time on the frontier. "You're new to town," he said, a statement rather than a question. "Yes." She handed him the roll, their fingers brushing momentarily. "I arrived last week, Mrs. Henderson was kind enough to offer me work." "Zeke Yardley," he said, surprising himself with the introduction. "Olivia Jennings," she replied after the briefest hesitation. "Pleased to meet you, Mr. Yardley." 22, maybe 23, Zeke guessed, old enough to have seen hardship, young enough to still hope for better, like everyone who came west. "Welcome to Clearwater Creek, Miss Jennings." He paid for his purchase and left, telling himself the encounter meant nothing. The West was full of pretty women with guarded eyes. He had a ranch to run and no room in his life for distractions. But 3 days later, when he returned to town for supplies, his boots carried him back to the bakery before he'd fully formed the intention to go there. Zeke might never have given Olivia Jennings another thought if not for the storm that hit the following week. April in Wyoming was unpredictable at best, but this tempest rolled in with particular fury, turning the afternoon sky an ominous green-black. He'd barely managed to secure his livestock and make it back to his cabin when the first marble-sized hail began to fall, quickly followed by sheets of rain so thick he could scarcely see 10 feet beyond his porch. The knock at his door came close to midnight, barely audible above the howling wind. Hand on his revolver, Zeke approached cautiously. Visitors in such weather rarely brought good news. "Who's there?" he called. "Please," came a woman's voice, trembling with cold or fear or both. "The stage overturned. I need help." When he opened the door, lightning illuminated Olivia Jennings, drenched to the skin, a cut above her eye slowly seeping blood down her pale face. Her chestnut hair hung in sodden ropes around her shoulders and her dress clung to her shivering form. "Miss Jennings," disbelief momentarily overrode caution. "What in God's name?" "I was traveling to Casper," she said, teeth chattering. "The driver tried to outrun the storm. We hit something, a fallen tree, I think." The stage rolled. "The others?" Zeke asked, already reaching for his coat. "The driver and another passenger, both thrown." "I couldn't," her voice broke. "They weren't moving. I walked until I saw your light." In the driving rain, Zeke found the overturned stagecoach a mile down the road, but it was immediately clear that no help could reach the other travelers in time. The driver's neck was broken, his eyes staring sightlessly at the storming heavens. The male passenger had been crushed beneath the coach itself. Back at the cabin, he built up the fire while Olivia changed into dry clothes he provided, an old shirt and trousers that dwarfed her slender frame. When she emerged from his bedroom, her face was washed clean of blood, revealing a bruise beginning to form along her cheekbone. "Thank you," she said simply, accepting the coffee he offered. "We'll ride to town when the storm breaks," Zeke said. "Sheriff will need to know about the accident." She nodded, her hands trembling slightly around the mug. In the firelight, with her damp hair falling loose around her shoulders and her eyes shadowed with exhaustion, she looked impossibly young and vulnerable. "Where were you heading?" he asked. "Casper, I have family there." The hesitation was slight but noticeable. "Funny, when we met, I got the impression you were planning to stay in Clearwater." Her eyes flicked up to his, then away. "Plans change. Especially when they were never real to begin with," Zeke observed, watching her carefully. Color rose in her cheeks. "I don't know what you're implying, Mr. Yardley." "I'm not implying anything, Miss Jennings. I'm just wondering what makes a woman run out in the middle of a storm rather than wait till morning." "I had my reasons. I'm sure you did." The silence between them stretched, broken only by the crackling of the fire and the persistent drumming of rain on the roof. Finally, she sighed. "Mrs. Henderson received a telegram. Her niece is arriving next week to help with the bakery." She stared into her coffee. "My position was temporary." It wasn't the whole truth, Zeke knew, but it was enough of one to make him nod. Jobs for women on the frontier were scarce, and a woman alone had few options. If she was running from something, it wasn't his business. "Get some sleep," he said, gesturing toward the bedroom. "I'll take the chair." "I couldn't possibly." "You can and you will. You've had a rough night. Morning will be here soon enough." She hesitated, then nodded. "Thank you for your kindness, Mr. Yardley." "Zeke," he said. "Just Zeke is fine." "Olivia," she replied with a small smile that, despite everything, reached her eyes. He watched her retreat to his bedroom, closing the door softly behind her. Outside, the storm raged on, but inside his small cabin something shifted, a crack in the armor he'd built around himself since his parents' deaths. It was unwelcome, that feeling, dangerous even. Zeke settled into his chair, rifle across his knees, and reminded himself of what he knew to be true: a man riding alone stayed alive. Whatever Olivia Jennings was running from, and she was definitely running, it wasn't his concern. Come morning, he'd take her to town, report the stagecoach accident, and that would be the end of it. Except it wasn't. When morning came, the storm had passed, leaving behind a landscape transformed by water and wind. Trees lay uprooted along the road, and streams had swollen to twice their size. What should have been a straightforward ride to town became a careful navigation around obstacles and washed-out sections of trail. Olivia rode behind him on his horse, her arms wrapped tentatively around his waist. She'd said little since waking, thanking him for breakfast and answering his practical questions about the accident, but offering nothing more. "Hold tighter," he instructed as they approached a particularly treacherous stretch. "I don't need you falling off." She complied, and he tried to ignore the warmth of her against his back, the faint scent of his soap on her skin. It had been a long time since he'd been this close to a woman who wasn't being paid for her company. They were halfway to town when they heard riders approaching. Zeke immediately guided his horse off the trail, into the cover of a stand of cottonwoods. "What is it?" Olivia whispered, tension evident in her voice. "Probably nothing," he said, though his hand rested on his revolver, "but better careful than dead." 3 riders appeared around the bend. moving at an easy pace. Two wore the plain clothes of working men, but the third, a heavy-set man with a sheriff's badge pinned to his vest, caught Zeke's attention immediately. "That's not our sheriff," he murmured. He felt Olivia stiffen behind him. "We should go," she said, her voice barely audible. "Please, Zeke." The urgency in her tone made him glance back at her. Her face had drained of color, her eyes fixed on the approaching men with undisguised fear. "You know them." She swallowed hard. "The one with the badge, that's Sheriff Dawson from Colorado." Understanding dawned with cold clarity, "And he's looking for you." It wasn't a question, but she answered anyway, her voice breaking. "Yes." Without another word, Zeke turned his horse deeper into the trees, away from the trail. He didn't know what Olivia had done to bring a sheriff across state lines after her, but instinct told him to hear her side before turning her over to the law. They rode in silence until they reached a small hunter's cabin Zeke knew of, abandoned years ago but still offering basic shelter. Only when they were inside, door barred, did he turn to face her. "Talk," he said simply. Olivia sank onto a rough wooden stool, her shoulders slumping as though under an invisible weight. "I didn't kill anyone, if that's what you're thinking." "I'm not thinking anything yet. Just waiting for facts." She looked up at him, those honey-brown eyes searching his face. "Why are you helping me? You don't know me." "Maybe that's why." Zeke leaned against the cabin wall. "Sheriff Dawson doesn't strike me as the type to ride this far after a petty thief, so either you did something terrible or someone terrible wants you found." A bitter smile touched her lips, the second one. "I'm listening." Olivia took a deep breath. "I was engaged to Sheriff Dawson's son, Mason. His father arranged it. I had no say in the matter. Mason was cruel, not at first, but once the engagement was announced." She touched her cheekbone, where the bruise from the stagecoach accident was darkening. "Let's just say it wasn't the first time I've worn marks like these." Zeke's jaw tightened, but he remained silent. 3 weeks ago, Mason hit me so hard I lost consciousness. When I woke up, I took what money I had saved and ran." Her hands twisted in her lap. "Sheriff Dawson is here because his son wants his property back. That's all I ever was to them." "And Mrs. Henderson?" "The job at the bakery." "All true, I didn't lie about that." She looked down. "I just omitted why I came to Wyoming instead of anywhere else. I thought I'd be far enough away that they wouldn't find me." Zeke studied her, looking for signs of deception, but finding only exhaustion and fear. He'd known men like Mason Dawson, men who believed ownership extended to the people in their lives, who saw violence as their right rather than their shame. "If I take you to town, our sheriff will want to speak with Dawson," he said finally. "And Dawson has the law on his side, even if it's wrong. Engagement is a binding contract in some places." "I know," her voice was barely above a whisper, "but if you don't go back to town, you'll be running forever. Wyoming's big, but not big enough to hide in forever." Olivia looked up, a flash of defiance in her eyes. "I'd rather run forever than go back to him." Something about her resolve struck a chord in Zeke. Here was someone who, like him, had learned that survival sometimes meant standing alone. Except she was facing a battle he couldn't imagine, against not just the frontier but the very law that was supposed to protect her. "There's a third option," he heard himself say. "My ranch is remote enough. You could stay there while I go to town, report the stagecoach accident, and find out what Dawson is telling people. Might give us time to figure out a better plan." "Us," she echoed, surprise evident in her voice. Zeke wasn't sure why he'd said it either. This was exactly the kind of complication he'd built his life to avoid. And yet, the thought of turning her over to Dawson, of condemning her to a life of fear and pain, sat like lead in his stomach. "Just until we know what we're dealing with," he clarified. Relief and gratitude flooded her expression. "Thank you, I promise I won't be a burden." "Don't make promises yet," Zeke warned. "This might not work. And if it doesn't, we'll both be in trouble." "I understand." He wasn't sure she did, wasn't sure he did himself. But as they rode back to his ranch, Olivia's arms more confidently wrapped around his waist now, Zeke recognized that something fundamental had shifted. For the first time in years, he'd chosen to involve himself in another person's troubles. It went against everything he believed about survival on the frontier, and yet it felt strangely, dangerously right. The next week passed in an uneasy rhythm. Zeke rode into town alone, reported finding the stagecoach and the bodies, and feigned ignorance when Sheriff Mills mentioned a missing female passenger. In the meantime, Olivia remained at his ranch, keeping out of sight whenever riders approached. To his surprise, she proved both capable and determined. She took over cooking without being asked, tidied his Spartan cabin, and even mended his shirts with neat, even stitches. When he returned from working the cattle one evening to find fresh bread cooling on his table, a luxury he'd never bothered with, the domesticity of it struck him like a physical blow. "You don't have to do all this," he told her. "You're not a servant." Olivia looked up from the stew she was stirring. "I know, but I want to be useful, and cooking calms my nerves." Zeke washed up at the basin, acutely aware of her presence in a space that had known only his solitude for years. "Any sign of trouble today?" "None, though your cattle seem to think I'm hiding food in my pockets. They follow me everywhere." He smiled despite himself. "They're just not used to anyone but me, especially someone who smells better." A faint blush colored her cheeks. "Sheriff Dawson, did you see him in town again?" The question sobered him instantly. He's still there, telling anyone who will listen about his son's runaway bride who stole family heirlooms before disappearing. Olivia's hand stilled on the ladle. "I took nothing but what was mine." "I believe you," and strangely he did. In the days they'd spent in close quarters, he'd seen nothing in her to suggest dishonesty, only a wary pride that reminded him of a wounded animal, cautious but not vicious. "But others won't," she said softly. "A sheriff's word against mine, I know how that ends." Zeke leaned against the rough-hewn table. "Mills is suspicious. Dawson's story keeps changing. First you stole money, then jewelry, then some fancy family Bible. Inconsistencies like that catch Mills's attention." Hope flickered briefly across her face. "So he might not help Dawson find me." "He might not, but Dawson's deputized those two men riding with him. They've been asking questions all over the county." Zeke hesitated, then added, "And they're offering a reward now, $200. The color drained from Olivia's face. "For me?" "For information leading to your whereabouts." She set down the ladle and sank into a chair, her hands trembling slightly. $200 would tempt even a decent man in these parts. "It would," Zeke agreed. "Which means we need a better plan than hiding you here indefinitely." She questioned again, looking up at him with those amber eyes that seemed to see right through his carefully constructed walls. Zeke hadn't meant to say it. This wasn't his fight, wasn't his problem, and yet somehow in the space of a week it had become so. The realization unsettled him. "You helped me bring in that stray calf yesterday," he said, deflecting. "Consider it payment for ranch work." A small smile touched her lips. "A fair trade, then." "Exactly." But as they sat down to eat the stew she'd prepared, an unexpected contentment settled over Zeke. The cabin felt different with her in it, warmer somehow, more like a home than just a place to sleep between work days. It was a dangerous feeling, he knew. Comfort bred complacency, and complacency got people killed. Still, as Olivia told him about the book she'd found on his shelf, a battered copy of The Last of the Mohicans his mother had given him years ago, he found himself relaxing in a way he'd nearly forgotten was possible. Later, as he lay on his bedroll by the fire, having insisted she take the bedroom, Zeke stared at the ceiling and admitted to himself what he'd been avoiding for days. Olivia Jennings had become more than just a woman in trouble. She'd become someone he cared about protecting, someone whose smile he looked for, whose voice eased the silence that had once been his only companion, and that made her the most dangerous person he'd encountered in years. The breaking point came 3 days later. Zeke had ridden to the north pasture to check on a broken fence line, leaving Olivia at the cabin with strict instructions to stay out of sight. He was halfway through repairs when he heard a horse approaching, fast, from the direction of his cabin. He had the rifle off his saddle before the rider came into view. When he saw it was Olivia, riding his second horse with more skill than he'd expected, his relief quickly gave way to alarm. "3 men," she gasped as she reined to a stop beside him. "Coming up the main trail, one of them is Sheriff Dawson." Zeke swore under his breath. "Did they see you?" "No. I was hanging laundry behind the cabin when I heard them. I came through the creek bed to avoid leaving tracks. Quick thinking, Zeke noted approvingly, even as his mind raced through their limited options. We can't go back to the cabin. And we can't head to town. Where then? He scanned the horizon, mentally mapping the territory. There's an old mining camp in the foothills about 15 miles northeast. Abandoned years ago, but the cabin should still be standing. Olivia's face was pale but determined. Lead the way. They rode hard for 2 hours, taking the most difficult terrain when possible to confuse any pursuit. By the time they reached the abandoned mining camp, little more than a rough cabin and the collapsed entrance to a played-out silver mine, the sun was beginning to set, painting the mountains in fiery hues of gold and crimson. The cabin was, as Zeke remembered, sturdy enough if dusty and cobwebbed from disuse. A single room with a stone fireplace, a narrow cot, and a rough table with one chair. He secured the horses in what remained of a lean-to at the back, then joined Olivia inside. She had already begun clearing away the worst of the dust, her practical nature asserting itself despite their precarious situation. "How did they find your ranch?" she asked, her voice steadier than he'd expected. "Could be coincidence," Zeke said, though he didn't believe it, "or someone in town mentioned I found the stagecoach. Made them curious enough to check. Or someone saw me." Olivia straightened, pushing a loose strand of hair from her face. "I tried to be careful, but—" "This isn't your fault," Zeke interrupted. "Dawson's the one breaking jurisdiction, hunting you across state lines for something you didn't do." She looked at him, surprise evident in her expression. "You believe me, then?" "Truly." "I believe what I've seen with my own eyes," he said simply. "And what I've seen is a woman willing to work hard, tell the truth, and face danger head-on rather than return to someone who hurt her." He paused. "That counts for something in my book." A smile touched her lips, transforming her face despite the dust and worry. "Thank you, Zeke." He nodded, uncomfortable with the warmth her gratitude stirred in him. "We'll stay here tonight. Come morning, we'll figure out our next move." With only one cot, Zeke prepared to sleep on the floor, but Olivia surprised him by suggesting they share it, back to back, for warmth and practicality in the chilly mountain air. It was a sensible solution, even if the thought of such proximity made Zeke unexpectedly nervous. They lay in awkward silence for a time, the weight of their situation heavy between them. "I never thought I'd be here," Olivia said finally, her voice soft in the darkness. "Running for my life with a man I barely know, sleeping in an abandoned mine." "Life takes strange turns out west," Zeke replied. "Nothing's ever certain except the ground beneath your feet." "And sometimes not even that," she murmured. "Before I met Mason Dawson I had plans, dreams even. I wanted to open my own bakery someday. Be my own woman." "You still can." "Can I?" The question hung in the air, weighted with doubt. "How do I build a life when I'm constantly looking over my shoulder, when the law itself isn't on my side?" Zeke had no answer for her. The frontier was harsh enough for those who lived within its rules. For those who found themselves outside them, it could be merciless. "My parents were killed by men who wanted what they had," he said instead, "our farm back in Nebraska. I was 16, learned pretty quick that in this world, depending on others is a weakness someone will exploit." Olivia was quiet for a moment. "Is that why you live alone so far from town?" "Seemed the safest way." "And now you're harboring a fugitive." There was a hint of bitter humor in her voice. "I've upended your entire philosophy in less than 2 weeks." Zeke found himself smiling in the darkness. "Seems that way." "I'm sorry." "Don't be." The words came out more firmly than he'd intended. "Some things are worth the risk." She shifted slightly and he felt her back press more solidly against his. "What happens tomorrow, Zeke?" "We keep moving, head deeper into the mountains until Dawson gives up and goes back to Colorado." "And if he doesn't give up?" The question hung between them, unanswered, as they drifted into an uneasy sleep. Dawn brought fog rolling down from the mountains, shrouding the abandoned mining camp in ghostly white. Zeke woke first, carefully extricating himself from the cot where Olivia still slept, her chestnut hair spread across the rough pillow. In sleep, the wariness left her face, leaving only youth and a delicate beauty that stirred something protective in his chest. He was checking the horses when he heard it, the distant sound of hoofbeats, muffled by fog but unmistakable. Cursing silently, he hurried back to the cabin. Olivia was already awake, her expression changing from sleepy confusion to alarm as she read his face. "They found us." "Someone did," Zeke said grimly, grabbing his rifle. "Get your things, we need to move." But as he peered through the cabin's single grimy window, he knew it was too late. 3 riders emerged from the fog, approaching slowly but deliberately, their guns already drawn. Sheriff Dawson's bulk was unmistakable even at a distance. "Is there another way out?" Olivia asked, her voice remarkably steady despite the fear evident in her eyes. Zeke shook his head. "Just the mine entrance, but it collapsed years ago. We'd never get through." She drew a deep breath. "Then I'll go out, talk to them, maybe if I explain." "No," Zeke's response was immediate and firm. "Dawson didn't come this far to talk." "I can't let you get hurt because of me," she insisted. "This is my fight." "It's our fight now." Zeke checked his rifle, then his revolver, "and I don't intend to lose it." Before she could argue further, a voice called from outside, not Dawson's but one of his deputies. "We know you're in there, Yardley. Send out the woman, and maybe you walk away from this." "Seems your reputation preceded you," Olivia remarked, a tremor finally evident in her voice. "Small towns talk." Zeke moved to position himself by the window, careful to stay out of direct line of sight. "And right now, they're saying I'm harboring a thief." "Yardley," the voice called again, "you've got 1 minute before we come in shooting." Zeke turned to Olivia, a plan forming. "There's a loose floorboard under the cot. Small space beneath, just enough for a person if they stay still." Her eyes widened with understanding. "You want me to hide while you, face 3 armed men alone?" "I want you to be safe while I convince them you're not here." He moved to the cot, quickly showing her the hidden space, a smuggler's hole most likely from the mining days. "If something happens to me, wait until dark, then take my horse and head north. There's a ranch about 20 miles from here, belongs to a man named Carter. He's a fair sort, might help you." "Zeke, no." "Time's up, Yardley." The shout was followed by the ominous click of rifles being cocked. "Please," Zeke said quietly, meeting Olivia's gaze. "Trust me." Something passed between them in that moment, an understanding beyond words, a connection forged through shared danger and quiet nights by the fire. After a heartbeat's hesitation, she nodded and quickly slipped into the hiding place. As Zeke replaced the floorboard, Olivia caught his hand. "Be careful," she whispered. He squeezed her fingers once, then stood and moved to the cabin door, rifle ready but pointed down. "Coming out," he called. "No need for shooting." He opened the door slowly, hands visible, and stepped onto the porch. Sheriff Dawson and his deputies had positioned themselves in a loose semicircle, all with weapons trained on him. Dawson was a thick-set man with a florid face and small, calculating eyes. His sheriff's badge gleamed dully in the foggy morning light. "Where is she, Yardley?" "Who?" Zeke kept his expression neutral. "Don't play dumb, boy. Olivia Jennings, the thief you've been harboring." Zeke leaned his rifle carefully against the cabin wall, maintaining eye contact with Dawson. "Don't know anyone by that name. I'm up here checking my old mining claim." One of the deputies, a thin, nervous-looking man with tobacco-stained teeth, spat on the ground. "Liar. We tracked you from your ranch." "You're welcome to search the cabin," Zeke offered, stepping aside, "but you'll be wasting your time." Dawson's eyes narrowed suspiciously. "Jenkins, check inside." "Thorough-like." The nervous deputy dismounted and approached the cabin, giving Zeke a wide berth as he passed. Zeke maintained his relaxed posture, though every muscle was tensed, ready to move. "What's your interest in this woman anyway, Yardley?" Dawson asked, his tone conversational despite the rifle still aimed at Zeke's chest. "She offers something special in exchange for protection." The implication made Zeke's jaw tighten, but he kept his voice level. "Like I said, I don't know her, but if I did, I might wonder why a Colorado sheriff is so determined to find one woman he claims stole from his son. Seems like a lot of effort for a simple theft." Dawson's face darkened. "My son's business is my business, and that woman is his property by right of engagement." "Women aren't property in Wyoming," Zeke remarked. "Might be different in Colorado." Before Dawson could respond, the deputy emerged from the cabin, shaking his head. "Nobody in there, Sheriff. Place is empty except for some old mining gear." Uncertainty flickered across Dawson's face. "Check again, under the floorboards if you have to." "Already did," the deputy lied easily, clearly eager to be done with the search. "Nothing there." Zeke kept his expression neutral, though relief washed through him. The deputy hadn't bothered with a thorough search, a stroke of luck he hadn't counted on. "Seems like you came all this way for nothing," he observed. Dawson's eyes remained cold. "Maybe or maybe you stashed her somewhere else." He gestured with his rifle. "Mount up, boys. We'll search the area." The nervous deputy looked relieved as he returned to his horse, but Dawson remained focused on Zeke. "Word of advice, Yardley. If you do come across Olivia Jennings, think twice before helping her. Woman's nothing but trouble, led my boy on, took advantage of his good nature, then robbed him blind when he trusted her most." "I'll keep that in mind," Zeke said evenly. "See that you do." Dawson finally lowered his rifle. "Because next time I might not be so inclined to believe your stories." The threat hung in the air as the three men turned their horses and rode back into the thinning fog. Zeke remained on the porch, watching until they disappeared from view, then waited several more minutes to ensure they were truly gone before returning to the cabin. He knelt by the cot and lifted the loose floorboard. "They're gone." Olivia emerged from the hiding place, dust in her hair and relief etched across her face. "That deputy," he barely looked around. "Lucky break," Zeke agreed, helping her to her feet. "But they'll be back once they realize there's nowhere else you could be." She brushed dirt from her skirt, her hands still trembling slightly. "What now?" "Now we leave before they circle back. I know these mountains better than they do. There's trails they won't find, places we can hide until they give up." "And if they don't give up," Olivia asked quietly, "I can't ask you to live as a fugitive because of me, Zeke. You have a ranch, a life. A life that didn't amount to much before you showed up," he found himself saying. The words surprised him as much as they seemed to surprise her. Olivia's eyes widened slightly. "What are you saying?" Zeke wasn't entirely sure himself. The past 2 weeks had upended everything he thought he knew about survival, about connection, about what mattered in the vast, unforgiving landscape of the West. All he knew for certain was that the thought of Olivia returning to Mason Dawson, or worse, facing frontier justice for crimes she didn't commit, was unacceptable. "I'm saying I made my choice when I helped you," he replied, "and I'm not changing my mind now." Something softened in her expression, a vulnerability she rarely allowed herself to show. "Why, Zeke? Why risk everything for someone you barely know?" The question hung between them, demanding an answer he wasn't sure he could articulate. Why indeed? Logic told him to protect himself, to prioritize his own survival as he always had. Yet something stronger than logic had taken hold, something he hadn't felt since before his parents' deaths. "Because for the first time in years," he said finally, "something matters more than just surviving." The words were simple, but they carried the weight of a revelation, for both of them. For a moment, Olivia seemed speechless, her amber eyes searching his face as though seeing him clearly for the first time. Then the moment was broken by the distant sound of hoofbeats, growing louder. "They're coming back," Zeke said grimly. "We need to move, now." They slipped out the back of the cabin and mounted the horses, Zeke leading them into a narrow ravine that wound deeper into the mountains. As they rode, a plan began to form in his mind, dangerous, perhaps foolish, but potentially their only chance at a life free from Dawson's pursuit. What he didn't yet know was that the most shocking revelation still awaited them, one that would test not only their growing bond but the very foundation of Olivia's identity. 3 days of hard riding through mountain passes and hidden valleys followed, with Zeke and Olivia staying off main trails and sleeping in makeshift camps. They saw no sign of Dawson and his men, but the constant vigilance wore on them both. Food was scarce, whatever they could hunt or forage, and the spring nights at higher elevations were bitterly cold. On the fourth morning, as they crested a ridge overlooking a small mountain town Zeke had never visited, Olivia finally asked the question that had clearly been on her mind. "What's your plan, Zeke? We can't keep running forever." He surveyed the town below Pine Tree, according to his map, a logging settlement barely large enough to warrant a general store and what appeared to be a single saloon. We need supplies. And information. Information. About Dawson, about whether he's still looking for us, and, he hesitated, about whether there's any truth to his claims about you. Olivia stiffened beside him. You still don't believe me. I believe you didn't steal anything, Zeke clarified, but I think there's more to this story than you've told me, something that explains why Dawson would cross state lines and risk his reputation to find you. Her gaze dropped to her hands, tightly gripping her horse's reins. There are things I haven't told you, she admitted quietly, not because I wanted to deceive you, but because I wanted to forget them myself. I'm listening now, he said gently. Olivia took a deep breath. Mason Dawson's father isn't just a sheriff, he's also one of the wealthiest men in the county, owns half the businesses in town, including the bank where I worked as a clerk. That's how I met Mason. Her voice took on a bitter edge. Sheriff Dawson arranged the position for me at the bank after my father died. I was grateful, too grateful to see it for what it was. What was it? A trap. She looked up at him, her amber eyes hard with remembered pain. My father left debts. Sheriff Dawson bought them all up, then offered me a choice. Marry his son or face debtor's prison. Zeke's jaw tightened. Blackmail. Exactly. Olivia's hands relaxed slightly on the reins. I agreed to the engagement because I had no choice. But when Mason's true nature emerged, when the beatings started, I knew I had to leave, no matter the consequences. And the theft Dawson accused you of. A flicker of hesitation crossed her face. Before I left, I took something from the sheriff's office, not money or jewelry, papers, documents that proved he'd been systematically cheating people out of their land and businesses for years. Understanding dawned. Insurance. She nodded. I hid them before I left town. I thought if Dawson ever found me, I could threaten to expose him. Her expression turned rueful. I underestimated how far he'd go to get them back and me with them. The pieces clicked into place. Not just a runaway bride, but a witness to corruption who possessed physical evidence. No wonder Dawson had pursued her across state lines. Where are these documents now? Zeke asked. Hidden, Olivia replied. In a place no one would think to look. Before she could elaborate, movement in the town below caught Zeke's attention. 3 riders were approaching the main street, and even at a distance, the bulky silhouette of Sheriff Dawson was unmistakable. Down, Zeke hissed, pulling Olivia off her horse and into the cover of some scrubby pines. Dawson's down there. They watched as the 3 men tied their horses outside the saloon and entered. Zeke's mind raced, calculating. They're asking questions, showing your description around. They won't stop, will they? Olivia whispered, her face pale. Not until they find you or the documents. He turned to her, decision made. We need those papers, they're our only leverage. They're hundreds of miles from here, Zeke, back in Colorado. Then that's where we're going. Her eyes widened. That's madness. It's the first place they'd look for us. Which is why they won't expect us to go there. Zeke glanced back at the town below. We'll circle around Pine Tree, gather supplies further north, then head east through the mountains. We can be in Colorado in a week if we push hard. And then what? Walk into the sheriff's office and demand he leave us alone. No, Zeke met her gaze steadily. We get the documents, make copies, and send them to every newspaper in Colorado. Once the evidence is public, Dawson loses his power over you. Olivia stared at him for a long moment, something like hope kindling in her eyes. It could work, she said slowly, but it's dangerous, Zeke, if we're caught. We won't be, he spoke with more confidence than he felt. Do you trust me? The question hung between them, weighted with everything unspoken. The growing bond that had formed through shared danger and quiet conversations by campfires, the way her presence had somehow broken through years of carefully constructed solitude. Yes, she said finally, I trust you. The journey to Colorado was grueling, long days in the saddle, nights spent in hastily made camps, always watching for Dawson's men or other threats. They skirted towns when possible, stopping only when absolutely necessary for supplies, using the last of Zeke's money. What surprised Zeke most was not the hardship of the journey, but how naturally they fell into a rhythm together. Olivia was tougher than her refined appearance suggested, never complaining despite the discomfort and danger. She learned quickly how to set snares for rabbits, how to start a fire with minimal smoke, how to read the landscape for signs of pursuit. And in the quiet evenings, as they huddled near small fires in the vast wilderness, they talked, really talked, in a way Zeke hadn't with another person since his parents' deaths. Olivia spoke of her childhood in St. Louis, her dreams of opening her own bakery someday, the books she loved. Zeke found himself sharing memories he'd long kept buried, his mother's laugh, his father's steady hands, the farm in Nebraska that had been home before violence took it all away. "Do you ever think of going back?" Olivia asked one night, the firelight playing across her features. "To Nebraska, I mean." Zeke poked at the embers with a stick. "Nothing to go back to. Land's long sold, parents buried. But it was home once. Home is just a word people use to make themselves feel better about where they sleep," he said, the words coming out harsher than intended. "The West taught me that much." Olivia was quiet for a moment. "I used to think that," she said finally, "after my father died and I lost our house to debts, but now I'm not so sure." "Why's that?" She looked up, meeting his gaze across the fire. "Because these past weeks with you, sleeping on the ground, running for our lives, I've felt more at home than I did in 2 years living under Sheriff Dawson's roof." The admission hung in the air between them, simple yet profound. Zeke found himself without words, unsettled by how deeply her statement resonated with his own unacknowledged feelings. "We should get some sleep," he said finally. "Long ride tomorrow." Olivia nodded, though her eyes held a question he wasn't ready to answer, not to her and certainly not to himself. As they approached the Colorado border, Zeke's unease grew. They were entering Dawson's territory now, where his influence would be strongest. The risk of recognition increased with every mile. "We need to change your appearance," he told Olivia as they made camp the night before they planned to cross into Colorado. "Your hair especially, it's too distinctive." She touched her chestnut locks self-consciously. "How?" From his saddlebag, Zeke produced a pair of scissors he'd purchased at their last supply stop. "Cut it short. And we bought that hat and men's clothes for a reason." Olivia's eyes widened. "You want me to pose as a man?" "A boy," Zeke clarified. "My younger brother traveling with me to visit relatives. No one looks twice at brothers on the trail." She considered this, then nodded decisively. "Do it." With careful hands, Zeke cut her long hair to just below her ears, a style that could pass for a young man's with the right hat. As the chestnut locks fell around them, Olivia remained silent, though he could feel the tension in her shoulders beneath his fingers. "I'm sorry," he said quietly. "Don't be," she replied. "It's just hair. It will grow back." She turned to face him, and in the moonlight, with her newly shorn hair framing her face, she looked younger but somehow stronger. "How do I look?" "Different," he admitted. "But your eyes, anyone who's looking carefully will still know you're a woman." "Then I'll have to make sure no one looks too carefully," she said, with a determination that stirred his admiration. "Show me how to walk like a man." The next morning, Olivia emerged from behind a stand of trees dressed in the boys' clothes they'd purchased, trousers, a loose shirt, and a vest, with her shortened hair tucked under a wide-brimmed hat. The transformation was remarkable. At a glance, she could pass for a youth of perhaps 16 or 17. "Remember to take longer strides," Zeke instructed as they mounted their horses, "and sit wider in the saddle. Men don't worry about looking graceful." She demonstrated, adjusting her posture to a more sprawling position, like this. "Better," he nodded approvingly, "and lower your voice when you speak. Don't overdo it, just aim for the bottom of your natural range." "I understand," she said, her voice deliberately deeper. "One more thing," Zeke added. "Your name, we should use something similar enough that you'll respond naturally." "Oliver," she suggested after a moment's thought. "Oliver Jenkins." "Oliver it is." Zeke surveyed their meager supplies, the rough clothes they wore, the determination in Olivia's eyes despite the danger ahead. "Ready to head into the lion's den, Oliver." She straightened in the saddle, chin raised. "As I'll ever be." They crossed into Colorado 2 days later, following back roads and game trails to avoid the main thoroughfares where Dawson might have posted men. The landscape changed subtly, more pine forests, steeper hills, signs of mining operations in the distance. By Olivia's directions, they were headed for Cedar Ridge, the small town where Dawson served as sheriff and his son as the local banker. Their plan was simple but risky: arrive after dark, retrieve the hidden documents, and be gone before morning, leaving no trace of their presence. As they rode, Zeke found himself watching Olivia with growing admiration. Her disguise as Oliver was surprisingly effective. She'd adopted a convincing swagger when they stopped at a trading post for final supplies, and the gruff shopkeeper hadn't given her a second glance. "You're a natural actress," Zeke observed as they continued their journey. A wry smile touched her lips. "When you grow up as a woman alone, you learn to be whatever the situation requires. Meek for angry men, cheerful for melancholy ones, invisible when necessary." The matter-of-fact way she said it struck Zeke like a physical blow. Here was a reality of frontier life he'd never had to consider, the constant adaptation women undertook simply to survive. "That's changing in Wyoming Territory," he said. "Women can vote there now, own property in their own names." "Is that why you settled there?" she asked curiously. Zeke shook his head. "Settled there because the land was good and the neighbors distant." He paused. "But I like that about Wyoming. Feels right that a woman should have say over her own life." Olivia studied him thoughtfully. "You're not what I expected, Zeke Yardley." "What did you expect?" "When we first met, a typical Western man, all stoic exterior hiding a heart that only cares about cattle and whiskey." Despite the tension of their situation, Zeke found himself chuckling. "And now? Now I know better," her voice softened. "You may pretend to be a lone wolf, but your heart betrays you at every turn." Before he could respond to that unsettling observation, they crested a hill and the town of Cedar Ridge came into view in the valley below, a cluster of buildings surrounded by pine forests, with mountains rising in the distance. Olivia drew a sharp breath. "I never thought I'd see this place again." "Having second thoughts?" Zeke asked quietly. She squared her shoulders. "No, but we should wait until dark before going in." They made camp in a protected hollow, out of sight of the town or any roads. As the sun began to set, Olivia grew increasingly tense, pacing the small clearing while Zeke prepared a cold meal of jerky and hardtack. "Tell me where you hid the documents," he said finally. "In case we get separated." She hesitated, then nodded. "The church has a small cemetery behind it. My mother's buried there. I hollowed out a space in the base of her headstone and sealed it with clay. The papers are wrapped in oilskin." Zeke raised an eyebrow. "Clever, no one would think to look there." "That was the idea." Olivia stopped pacing and sat beside him, accepting the food he offered. "I visited her grave every Sunday after service. It was the one time I could be sure neither Mason nor his father would follow me." "How will we know which stone is hers?" "Sarah Jennings died 1879. A shadow passed over Olivia's face. 4 years ago this month." Zeke wanted to offer comfort but didn't know how. Instead, he focused on practicalities. "We'll enter town from the north after midnight, go straight to the cemetery, get the documents, and be gone before first light." Olivia nodded, though fear lingered in her eyes. "And if someone sees us?" "Then we run," Zeke said simply, "together." The word hung between them, carrying more weight than its 2 syllables should allow. Together. It was a promise Zeke hadn't intended to make, but one he found he couldn't retract. Darkness fell completely around 10 o'clock. They waited another 2 hours until the small town would likely be asleep before mounting their horses and approaching from the north, as planned. The night was clear, stars sharp and bright against the black sky, with just enough moonlight to see by. Cedar Ridge was silent as they rode slowly down the main street, past darkened storefronts and closed saloons. Only the occasional lamp burned in upstairs windows, night owls or insomniacs unable to sleep. Zeke kept his hand near his revolver, eyes constantly scanning for movement, but the town seemed genuinely asleep. The church stood at the far end of the main street, a simple white clapboard building with a modest steeple. Olivia pointed to a narrow path beside it that led to the cemetery in the rear. They dismounted and secured their horses to a hitching post, moving as silently as possible. Zeke followed Olivia through the small graveyard, past weathered stones bearing the names of Cedar Ridge's departed citizens. She moved with certainty despite the years away, navigating directly to a modest headstone near the back wall. "Here," she whispered, kneeling before a simple marker, "Sarah Jennings' beloved mother." Zeke stood guard, watching the church and surrounding area while Olivia worked quickly, her fingers searching the base of the headstone for the hidden compartment. After a tense minute, he heard her small sound of triumph. "Got it," she said, extracting a small oilskin package. "It's still here." Relief washed through him. "Let's go then, quickly." But as they turned to leave, a voice spoke from the shadows near the church. "Well, well. The prodigal daughter returns." They froze. A figure stepped forward, moonlight revealing Mason Dawson, younger than his father but with the same thick build and small, calculating eyes. In his hand gleamed the unmistakable silhouette of a revolver. "Mason," Olivia breathed, instinctively moving closer to Zeke, "and in men's clothing no less." Mason's voice carried a lazy cruelty. "How scandalous, Olivia. What would your sainted mother think?" Zeke shifted slightly, positioning himself between Olivia and Mason's gun. "We don't want trouble, just passing through." Mason's laugh held no humor. "Passing through with what belongs to me," his gaze fixed on the package in Olivia's hand. "Did you really think my father wouldn't have someone watching her mother's grave? It was only a matter of time before you came for those papers." "They don't belong to you," Olivia said, her voice stronger than Zeke expected. "They belong to the people you and your father have been stealing from for years." Such dramatics. Mason took a step closer, his gun unwavering. "Hand them over, and maybe I'll let your companion live." Zeke felt rather than saw Olivia's hesitation. "Don't," he said quietly, "he'll shoot us both regardless." "Smart man," Mason observed, "but it doesn't change the outcome. Those papers and Olivia are coming with me. You, sir, are expendable." In the tense silence that followed, Zeke became acutely aware of several things at once. The weight of his revolver against his hip, the slight tremor in Mason's gun hand suggesting either drink or nerves, and the fact that Olivia had shifted the oilskin package behind her back. "I'll go with you," she said suddenly. "Just let him leave unharmed." "Olivia, no," Zeke protested. "It's my choice, Zeke." Her eyes met his, communicating something he couldn't quite decipher. "I won't have your blood on my hands." Mason smiled, the expression chilling in the moonlight. "How touching, but I'm afraid Mr. Yardley knows too much to simply ride away." "Then you'll have to shoot me," Olivia said, stepping forward, "because I'm not giving you these papers." In one fluid motion, she threw the oilskin package over the cemetery wall and lunged toward Mason. The unexpected movement caught him off guard. His shot went wide as Olivia crashed into him, sending them both to the ground. Zeke drew his revolver, but hesitated to fire with Olivia and Mason grappling in a chaotic tangle of limbs. Instead, he rushed forward, aiming to separate them and disarm Mason. But Mason recovered quickly, shoving Olivia aside with brutal force and swinging his gun toward Zeke. The shot exploded in the quiet cemetery, the bullet whistling past Zeke's ear close enough that he felt its passage. Zeke fired back, his shot finding its mark in Mason's shoulder. The man howled in pain but didn't drop his weapon. As Mason raised his gun for another shot, a second report split the night, but this time, the shot came from behind Zeke. Mason's expression transformed from rage to confusion as he looked down at the spreading red stain on his chest. His gun slipped from suddenly lifeless fingers as he crumpled to the ground. Zeke spun around to find Olivia standing with a small derringer in her hand, her face pale but resolute in the moonlight. "He would have killed you," she said simply. Before Zeke could respond, shouts erupted from the direction of the town. Mason's shot had awakened Cedar Ridge, and from the sounds of it, help was on its way. "We need to go," Zeke said urgently, taking Olivia's arm. "No." They ran to retrieve the oilskin package from beyond the cemetery wall, then sprinted for their horses. As they mounted and spurred the animals into motion, more shouts rose behind them, and among them the distinctive bellow of Sheriff Dawson calling for his son. They rode hard, taking the north road out of town before veering off into the dense pine forest where pursuit would be more difficult. Neither spoke until they were miles from Cedar Ridge, the sounds of the town long faded behind them. Finally, as they paused to let their winded horses rest, Zeke turned to Olivia. "You shot him." She nodded, her face shadowed beneath the brim of her hat. "I did. I didn't know you carried a gun. My father taught me to shoot before he died." Her voice was steady despite the tremor in her hands. "The Derringer was his. I've kept it hidden in my boot since the day I left Cedar Ridge." Zeke studied her in the dim light filtering through the pines. "Are you all right?" For a moment she didn't answer, then, "I don't know." "I never thought I'd," she trailed off, looking down at her hands as though seeing them for the first time. "Is he dead, do you think?" "Probably," Zeke said honestly. "That shot was center mass." Olivia drew a shaky breath. "I should feel guilty. Or afraid, but all I feel is relief." She looked up, meeting his gaze with unexpected directness. "Does that make me a monster?" "No," Zeke said firmly, "it makes you human. He would have killed us both without hesitation." She nodded slowly, some of the tension leaving her shoulders. "What happens now?" It was a question Zeke had been asking himself since they fled the cemetery. "Dawson will come after us with everything he has. Mason was his only son." He paused, considering their limited options. "We need to get these documents to someone who can use them, a newspaper editor maybe, or a federal marshal." "Denver," Olivia suggested. "It's 2 days' ride south, large enough that Dawson's influence won't reach there." "Denver it is then." Zeke checked their horses, judging whether the animals could continue. "We should keep moving, put as much distance between us and Cedar Ridge as possible before dawn." As they mounted again, Olivia suddenly reached out, catching Zeke's arm. "Thank you," she said softly, "for everything, for believing in me when you had no reason to." The simple sincerity in her words caught him off guard. In the pale moonlight filtering through the trees, with her shorn hair and men's clothing, she looked both vulnerable and stronger than he'd ever seen her, a contradiction that somehow embodied everything that had drawn him to her from the beginning. "I had every reason," he replied, his voice rougher than intended. "You gave me plenty." They rode through the night, stopping only when the horses needed rest, pushing southeast toward Denver and whatever chance at freedom the city might offer. Behind them, Zeke knew Sheriff Dawson would be organizing a posse, men with fresh horses and the law on their side, at least nominally. By dawn, they had covered nearly 20 miles of rough country. They made camp in a sheltered ravine, building only the smallest fire to brew coffee and warm their exhausted bodies. While Olivia slept fitfully, Zeke examined the documents they'd risked so much to retrieve. The oilskin package contained deeds, bank records, and letters, evidence of a systematic campaign by Sheriff Dawson and his son to defraud local miners and homesteaders of their property through manipulated loans and falsified claims. Most damning of all was a letter from a federal land office official acknowledging receipt of a substantial bribe to overlook irregularities in the Dawsons' land acquisitions. It was, Zeke realized, more than enough to destroy the sheriff's reputation and possibly send him to prison. Olivia stirred and sat up, rubbing sleep from her eyes. In the harsh morning light, the strain of their journey showed clearly on her face, smudges of dirt, dark circles beneath her eyes, the hastily cut hair now tangled from sleep. Yet something had changed since the confrontation in the cemetery. A new resolve seemed to straighten her shoulders, a certainty that hadn't been there before. "The papers," she said, nodding toward the documents in Zeke's hands. "Are they what you expected?" "More," he admitted. "This is enough to ruin Dawson completely." "Good," the single word carried years of suppressed anger and fear. "He deserves it." Zeke carefully rewrapped the documents. "We should reach Denver by tomorrow night if we push hard, once these are in the hands of a newspaper editor." "And then what?" Olivia interrupted. "For you, I mean." The question caught him off guard. In the chaos of the past weeks, Zeke had thought little beyond immediate survival, the next meal, the next safe place to sleep, the next step in their escape. The future beyond delivering the documents had remained deliberately unexamined. "I don't know," he admitted. "Back to Wyoming, I suppose. My ranch is still there." "Of course," Olivia nodded, her expression carefully neutral. "That makes sense." An awkward silence fell between them, the first since their journey began. Zeke found himself wanting to say more to acknowledge the unspoken question hanging in the air: where did Olivia fit in that future? But the words wouldn't come. Instead, he focused on practicalities. We should get moving. Dawson's men won't be far behind. They broke camp quickly, erasing all signs of their presence, and continued their journey toward Denver. The terrain grew increasingly difficult as they entered the foothills, forcing them to slow their pace despite the danger of pursuit. By midday, they'd reached a high pass that offered a panoramic view of the country they'd traversed. In the far distance, Zeke spotted what he'd been dreading: a plume of dust moving steadily along the trail below, at least 6 riders pushing hard. "Dawson," he said grimly, pointing out the dust cloud to Olivia. Her face paled. "They're gaining on us. Our horses are tired, theirs are fresh." Zeke studied the terrain ahead, calculating distances and possibilities. "We need to find a place to make a stand." "A stand," Olivia echoed. "Zeke, there must be 6 men down there." "7 by my count," he met her gaze steadily. "We can't outrun them, but we might be able to outfight them if we choose the right ground." The fear in her eyes was tempered by determination. "Tell me what to do." They rode for another hour, searching for defensible terrain, finally settling on a narrow canyon with steep walls and a small stream running through it. A jumble of boulders at one end provided natural cover, while the canyon's mouth created a bottleneck that would force any attackers to come in a few at a time. As they secured the horses in a protected alcove and prepared their position, Zeke found himself watching Olivia with growing admiration. Despite everything, the danger, the exhaustion, the knowledge that trained men were hunting them, she worked methodically, checking her derringer, gathering stones to use as additional weapons, positioning herself with a clear line of fire. "You should have been born in the West," he observed as they settled behind the boulders, rifles ready. A ghost of a smile touched her lips. "I think I was born wherever brought me to this moment." The philosophical turn surprised him. "And what moment is that, about to face down a vengeful sheriff and his posse?" "No," her eyes met his, serious and direct. "The moment I stopped running from who I am." Before Zeke could respond, the distant sound of hoofbeats echoed through the canyon. Dawson's men had found their trail. "Here they come," Zeke murmured, adjusting his grip on his rifle. "Remember, wait for a clear shot, make each bullet count." Olivia nodded, tension visible in every line of her body but her hands steady on her weapon. The riders appeared at the canyon's entrance, 7 men, as Zeke had counted, with Sheriff Dawson's bulky figure prominent among them. They paused, clearly aware they were entering potential ambush territory. "Yardley," Dawson's voice boomed between the canyon walls. "I know you're in there. Send out the woman and maybe we can talk terms." "No terms to discuss, Dawson," Zeke called back. "We have the documents. By now, copies are already on their way to Denver." The lie might give them an edge if Dawson believed it. A stream of profanity was the only response. Then, after a muttered conference among the posse, Dawson spoke again. "You killed my son, you bastards. There's no walking away from that." Beside him, Zeke felt Olivia tense. "It was self-defense," she called out, her voice stronger than he expected. "Just like when I ran from your house after Mason broke my ribs last Christmas." A shocked murmur ran through the posse at her words. Zeke realized that at least some of Dawson's men might not know the full story, might believe they were pursuing an ordinary thief rather than a woman fleeing abuse. Dawson sensed the shift as well. "She's lying," he shouted. "Mason treated her like a queen. She repaid him by stealing family heirlooms and running off with her lover." "Then why are you so desperate for these papers?" Olivia countered. "If they're just deeds and bank records, why chase us across state lines?" Another murmur from the posse, louder this time. One of the men, a younger deputy Zeke hadn't seen before, turned to Dawson with a questioning look. "Enough talk," Dawson roared. "She's a murderer and a thief. $500 to the man who brings her in." The mention of such a substantial reward silenced any doubts among the posse. As one, they spurred their horses forward into the canyon, spreading out to present more difficult targets. "Here we go," Zeke muttered. "Wait until they're in range." The first shot came from Dawson himself, a wild effort that splintered rock 10 feet to their left. Zeke held his fire, waiting until the riders drew closer. At 50 yards, he squeezed the trigger. His shot found one of the deputies, sending the man tumbling from his saddle with a cry of pain. Beside him, Olivia fired the rifle he'd given her, less accurately but enough to make another rider veer sharply, losing control of his horse. The remaining men quickly dismounted, seeking cover among the scattered rocks at the canyon's floor. What followed was a tense exchange of gunfire, with neither side able to gain a clear advantage. Zeke and Olivia had the better position, but Dawson's men had numbers and ammunition on their side. As the standoff continued, Zeke became aware of a new problem. The sun was beginning to set, and with darkness would come increased danger. Dawson's men could use the cover of night to work their way closer, potentially outflanking their position. "We need to end this before dark," he whispered to Olivia during a lull in the shooting. She nodded grimly. "How?" Before Zeke could answer, a shout came from the canyon entrance. A new group of riders had arrived, but instead of reinforcements for Dawson, Zeke was stunned to see a familiar figure at their head. "Sheriff Mills," he said incredulously. The Clearwater Creek sheriff had brought 4 deputies with him, all with rifles trained on Dawson's posse. "That's far enough, Dawson," Mills called. "You're outside your jurisdiction, and I've got telegrams from the territorial governor suggesting you're abusing your authority." Dawson spun toward the new threat, his face mottled with rage. "This is none of your business, Mills. These fugitives killed my son." "So you said in your wire." Mills remained implacable, his deputies spreading out in a practiced formation. "But I've also got statements from 3 Cedar Ridge citizens about your son's treatment of Miss Jennings. And interesting telegrams from the Federal Land Office about an ongoing investigation into your affairs." Zeke exchanged a startled glance with Olivia. How had Mills known where to find them? The standoff between the 2 lawmen stretched for several tense moments. Finally, Dawson's shoulders slumped, the fight visibly draining from him. "Surrender your weapons, gentlemen," Mills instructed Dawson's posse. "This ends now." To Zeke's relief, the men complied one by one, laying down their guns with varying degrees of reluctance. Only Dawson himself hesitated, his hand still on his revolver. "It's over, Dawson," Mills said quietly. "Don't make this worse than it already is." For a terrible moment, Zeke thought the Colorado sheriff would draw, forcing Mills to kill him and potentially starting a gun battle that could claim many lives. But finally, with a curse, Dawson removed his gun belt and threw it to the ground. As Mills's deputies moved in to secure the prisoners, Zeke and Olivia emerged cautiously from their defensive position, weapons still ready. "How did you find us?" Zeke asked Mills as they approached. The sheriff smiled slightly. "Wasn't hard. When Dawson started asking about you 2 in Clearwater, I got suspicious. Then a telegram came from the federal marshal in Denver about corruption allegations against Dawson." He nodded toward Olivia. "Figured you must be the woman mentioned in the investigation, the one with evidence." "But how did you know we'd be here in this canyon?" Olivia pressed. "Tracked Dawson tracking you," Mills said simply. "Man's a decent sheriff but a lousy woodsman, leaves signs a child could follow." As Dawson was led away, he fixed Olivia with a hate-filled glare. "This isn't over," he spat. "Mason was beloved in Cedar Ridge. No jury will convict me once they hear what you did to him." "They might once they see these," Olivia replied, holding up the oilskin package, "and hear testimonies from all the people you cheated and threatened." Mills took the documents with raised eyebrows. "This what I think it is. Evidence of land fraud, bribery of federal officials, and coercion," Zeke confirmed. "Enough to put Dawson away for years." "Then I'll make sure it reaches the right hands." Mills tucked the package securely inside his coat. "Now, Miss Jennings, we need to discuss the matter of Mason Dawson's death." Olivia's face paled, but she stood straight, meeting the sheriff's gaze directly. "It was self-defense, Sheriff. He would have killed Zeke and then me." "I believe you," Mills said, surprising them both. "And I've got witnesses back in Cedar Ridge who'll testify to Mason's violent nature. Still, there'll need to be an inquest." "She'll stand trial?" Zeke asked, tension returning to his shoulders. "A hearing, at least, but with the evidence against the Dawsons coming to light, I'd say Miss Jennings has little to worry about." Mills glanced between them. "You 2 look dead on your feet. There's a town about 10 miles south, Eagle Pass. decent hotel, telegraph office. I suggest you get some rest while I transport these men back to Clearwater. I'll need your full statements later." As Mills organized his deputies and prisoners for the journey, Zeke turned to Olivia. In the fading light, with her face smudged with dirt and gunpowder, she looked both exhausted and strangely exhilarated, as though the confrontation had lifted a weight she'd carried for years. "It's over," she said quietly, "really over." "Almost," Zeke corrected, "there's still the hearing. But Dawson can't hurt me anymore, that's what matters." She looked up at him, a question in her amber eyes. "What happens now, Zeke?" It was the second time she'd asked that question, but this time, Zeke didn't deflect. The past weeks had changed him in ways he was only beginning to understand, breaking down the walls he'd built since his parents' deaths, showing him that connection wasn't always a weakness to be avoided. "Now," he said slowly, "we go to Eagle Pass, get some real food and sleep in actual beds, and then—" "And then," she prompted when he trailed off. Zeke took a deep breath, stepping into unfamiliar territory. "And then, if you want, we head back to Wyoming, together." The word hung between them, its meaning unmistakable. Olivia studied his face as though searching for uncertainty or reservation. "Your ranch," she said carefully, "it's isolated. Far from town." "It is." "And you've always preferred it that way, being alone." Zeke nodded slowly. "I did, until a woman with no past showed up in my bakery and changed everything I thought I knew about survival." A smile bloomed across Olivia's face, not the careful, guarded expression he'd first seen in Clearwater Creek, but something radiant and real. "I'd like that," she said simply, "very much." As they mounted their horses and rode toward Eagle Pass, side by side in the gathering darkness, Zeke reflected on the strange journey that had brought them to this point. He'd spent years believing that a man riding alone stayed alive, that attachments were vulnerabilities, that the frontier was no place for connection or tenderness. Now, watching Olivia ride beside him, her profile determined in the last light of day, he understood what he'd been missing. The West wasn't just about survival, it was about finding something worth surviving for. The inquest into Mason Dawson's death was held 2 weeks later in Denver, where federal authorities had taken over the investigation into Sheriff Dawson's corrupt practices. As Mills had predicted, Olivia was cleared of all charges. The testimonies of Cedar Ridge citizens about Mason's violent nature, combined with Zeke's account of the confrontation in the cemetery, left the judge little choice but to rule the shooting justified self-defense. Sheriff Dawson himself faced multiple federal charges, his empire of corruption crumbling as witnesses came forward, emboldened by his fall from power. The newspapers that published the evidence from Olivia's documents called it one of the most significant cases of frontier justice in Colorado's history. Through it all, Zeke remained by Olivia's side, a steady presence during her testimony, a reassuring hand on her shoulder when the strain became too much. When the final verdict was delivered, exonerating her completely, the relief that washed over her face was something he knew he'd remember for the rest of his life. "Ready to go home?" he asked as they left the Denver courthouse for the last time. Olivia looked up at him, the sun catching the chestnut hints in her slowly growing hair. "Home," she repeated as though testing the word. "Yes. I think I am." They returned to Wyoming as summer bloomed across the frontier, the journey back far easier than their desperate flight had been. Zeke's small ranch stood untouched, the cattle looked after by a neighbor in his absence. As they rode up to the cabin, a simple structure that suddenly seemed inadequate through Zeke's new eyes, he felt an unexpected nervousness. "It's not much," he said, gesturing at the modest homestead. "Nothing like a proper town house." Olivia dismounted, surveying the ranch with a thoughtful expression. The afternoon sun bathed the rolling pastures in golden light, the distant mountains providing a majestic backdrop to the scene. "It's perfect," she said finally, turning to him with a smile, "a place where we can both start over." And they did. Over the following months, the ranch transformed under their joint efforts, Olivia's practical touches softening the cabin's Spartan interior, Zeke's carpentry skills expanding the structure to include a proper kitchen and second bedroom. The garden she planted yielded vegetables and flowers in equal measure, bringing color and sustenance to their lives. Word of their adventures spread through Clearwater Creek. Of course, frontier towns thrived on such stories. But to Zeke's surprise, the community's response was largely supportive. Sheriff Mills had made sure the full truth was known, and the citizens of Wyoming Territory had little sympathy for men who abused their power or their women. On a crisp autumn evening, as they sat on the cabin's newly built porch watching the sunset paint the distant mountains, Zeke found himself contemplating how completely his life had changed in the span of 6 months. "What are you thinking?" Olivia asked, her hand finding his in the gathering dusk. "That I was wrong," he admitted. "All those years I thought the key to survival was staying alone. Keeping everyone at a distance. And now—" He turned to look at her, this remarkable woman who had fought her way through so much darkness to reach this moment. Her hair had grown out to her shoulders again, the chestnut waves catching the last light of day. But it was her eyes that captivated him most, clear amber, no longer shadowed by fear or the weight of secrets. "Now I know that surviving isn't enough," he said quietly. "Not if you're just surviving for yourself." Olivia's smile was soft in the fading light. "So what are you surviving for now, Zeke Yardley?" In answer, he reached into his pocket and withdrew a small object, a simple gold band he'd purchased on their last trip to town. "For a future," he said, his voice rough with emotion. "For a home for us if you'll have me." Her eyes widened as she recognized the ring, then filled with tears that caught the sunset's glow. "Are you asking what I think you're asking?" "I'm asking if you'll marry me, Olivia Jennings," Zeke said, the words coming easier than he'd expected. "If you'll build a life with me here where no one from your past can ever hurt you again. Where we can face whatever comes together." For a moment she was silent and doubt flickered through him. Then she leaned forward, pressing her forehead against his, her hand coming up to cup his cheek. "Yes," she whispered, the single word carrying all the promise of their shared future. 1,000 times yes. They were married in Clearwater Creek's small church the following spring, with Sheriff Mills standing as Zeke's best man and Mrs. Henderson from the bakery beaming proudly from the front pew. Olivia wore a simple white dress with wildflowers in her hair, looking, Zeke thought, like everything he'd never known he wanted. The ranch prospered under their joint care, Zeke's cattle operation expanding, Olivia's garden growing into a small but profitable source of fresh produce for the town. When she opened a modest bakery in Clearwater Creek 2 years later, using her mother's recipes and the skills she'd refined during those early days when they first met, it became a gathering place for the community. And if visitors to the ranch sometimes noticed the Derringer Olivia still kept in a drawer by the bed, or the way Zeke's eyes still scanned the horizon when riders approached, they understood. The frontier had taught them both hard lessons about vigilance, but it had taught them something else, too, something about the power of trust, of connection, of choosing to believe in a shared future despite the risks. Something about how love could exist even in the harshest landscapes, perhaps especially there, where it was needed most. On warm summer evenings, they would often sit together on their porch, watching the sunset paint the Wyoming sky in impossible colors, their hands intertwined, their silence comfortable in a way that only people who have faced death together can understand. And sometimes, Olivia would look at her husband, this man who had once believed so firmly in solitude, and marvel at how completely a person could change when given the right reasons. "No regrets?" she would ask occasionally, though she already knew the answer. And Zeke, watching the life they'd built together spread before them, the thriving ranch, the home filled with warmth and purpose, would shake his head and pull her closer. "Not one," he would reply, meaning it more with each passing year. "Not a single one."